and is required to meet savings targets, or the payment is withheld, so they are penalized and do not profit. So it's profit driven. And 2006, Efficiency Vermont met 1% of total utility sales with energy efficiency, and the plan for 2007 and 2008 was 3.5%, so nearly 2% per year, and they were supposedly did meet that. So that's a novel approach. Illinois is recently passed one in 2007, starts at 0.2% in 2008, ramps up to 2% per year in 2015. And
0.2% of...
0.2% of total electricity sales. So essentially, as every year they have to meet 0.2% of energy efficiency. And that ramps up every year. So by the year 2015, 2% of energy sales has to be met with energy efficiency. So you have a certain amount of kilowatts, they have to reduce their consumption by 2% essentially. So energy efficiency can be looked at as a resource, since if you build, say you need 2% growth, to meet that you have to build a power plant. So instead of building that power plant, you could just decrease your consumption by 2% by implementing energy efficiency. And energy efficiency is not about, say, a lot of people confuse energy efficiency with essentially cutting back on, say, turning down your thermostat or driving less. That's not energy efficiency, that is conservation. Energy efficiency is getting the same amount of work for less energy. So improving energy efficiency, you still have your thermostat at 70, you're just using 30% less gas because you with high efficiency windows and high efficiency and a lot of insulation and high efficiency furnace. So there is a difference there. Conservation can also go a long way as well, involving consumers in giving them price signals for how much their electricity costs for all of the types of behaviors that they perform around their house. So this is an interesting chart. This was created by the Climate Strategies Group at DC, which is a large consultant that has drafted a lot of climate policies, or essentially assisted states in implementing their climate policies. So actually drafted the actual nuts and bolts approaches to how they're going to meet their reductions. And according to their research, and I think this is fairly obvious actually, you can actually decrease the cost of carbon reduction by increasing energy efficiency significantly. So the yellow line essentially shows a 1% energy efficiency requirement per year by the utility, and the black line is the 2% energy efficiency requirement. So essentially cuts in half the cost of carbon, the cost per ton of carbon. Since you're decreasing consumption significantly, that means you're decreasing the need to build new power plants, such as either wind or solar, or plants with carbon capture. And say a coal-powered fire plant with carbon capture and sequestration is really expensive. If you can increase energy efficiency, decrease the need to build that, you can dramatically decrease the cost of reducing carbon. And also just the cost of energy in general. It has nothing to do necessarily with carbon reduction. It has everything to do with just, even if you do not have a cap and trade in effect, you are reducing your consumer costs significantly by increasing your energy efficiency requirements.
Good question.
Yeah.
In the current bill before the House, the parts, according to Farmer's office, the parts on renewable energy are probably going to sail through conservation, going to sail through cap and trade, will be heated debate.
There's argument about some folks aren't completely on board with the effect that individual state actions will have on international emissions of carbon, and whether, well, why should we pass a policy if we don't know whether our little state reduction is actually will have any impact on climate change. And there's also folks who don't believe that carbon emissions or human emissions are causing climate change. So there's those two fronts, but there are definitely people who believe in climate change, but they're like, well, why should we increase costs of emissions or increase costs of energy here if it will have no impact on the climate change? So I think that's two reasons. Yes.
Well, the competitive disadvantage argument, if we implement cap and trade and increase the price of our electricity, then what if China and India don't do it, then we're just shipping more jobs over to them as part of the argument.
Yeah, and actually what's interesting is the carbon intensity of power plants in China is much higher than it is here. So when we send manufacturing over there and say steel production over there, instead of doing it here, while it's somewhat cheaper, we're producing maybe double the amount of carbon because they're really inefficient. They're just building, once a week, they're building these new pulverized coal plants, which are just the least efficient, easiest, cheapest route to produce more energy. So there's that concern as well. But I think China, they're concerned as well because there's some serious problems that they may have with the melting of the Himalayas and the loss of water coming into their country if climate change proceeds as forecast. So it's definitely a big issue there. So I think there's a number of reasons why people are still concerned about that. Now, you can meet similar, if you just do energy efficiency, there are arguments as well. If you do stringent energy efficiency and high RPS, you can meet the same goals possibly at a lot less expense because you don't introduce this trading mechanism and the scheme where you have these secondary markets and the potential for derivatives and traders driving up the price to make profits and driving up the price of carbon. And that, while it's interesting free market approach, it seems like it's the most effective way, there are arguments that direct requirements for renewable energy, which is going to be the end result to some extent, or you can just do a low carbon portfolio standard. Ohio has taken the approach of requiring, they have a 25% standard, I can't remember what it's like new clean energy standard. It's not called renewable energy, but half of that has to come from renewables. The other half can come from carbon capture and sequestration. So essentially a low carbon, you could do a low carbon standard. And that may be less expensive. Some argue that that's less expensive than doing this extremely complex cap and trade approach. Or, just go with the carbon tax. And there's a lot of arguments that I think are fairly strong. I don't take a side, of course, but since we're a bipartisan organization and we just inform, but there's a lot of arguments that are fairly strong on the side of looking at other approaches to reducing greenhouse gases that may be less costly than the cap and trade approach.
And one of the other points that I just listened to a lot of the ACES, hearings that they had the other day, and one of the other points was a lot of the states down in the south don't have a lot of wind, which is the cheap stuff. And so they're looking at it as saying, well, what are we going to do if we have to do this? And especially if nuclear doesn't count for them, which is the other option that, of course, they're very big on.
Yeah,
exactly. They mention
exactly.
nuclear a lot, when they're up to talk.
And that's where the goals come in. What's your goal? Your goal is to reduce carbon. Maybe you should allow nuclear. However, I think in a free market, if you look at the cost of building new nuclear, that may not be all that competitive. So, and it may be, who knows, but it probably varies based on the state. It needs some serious federal support for when it comes to managing risk, and insurance. Finally, I just have a few more slides. I'll quickly rush through here. Since buildings consume approximately 40% of all energy in the U.S. and 70% of all electricity, they are seen as a critical component to any energy efficiency program and also addressing our growing energy demand. So 15 states have passed high-performance building requirements. Those are required